I'm sure Steve Vos is sitting over there with so much to say. I mean, I can see him. His brain is just working 1,000 miles an hour. And so I'm really pleased that we have Steve Vos here to respond to the second half of panels. Just as an introduction, Stephen Vos is a historian of Jain communities in Western India, and he has a PhD in South Asian Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. He holds the Bhagwan Suparshvanatha Professorship in Jain Studies at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he is an assistant professor in the Department of History. And he's our respondent again to the second half of today's papers. So everybody, please welcome Dr. Stephen Vos.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kojin. Wow. Yeah, what a fantastic group of papers. And I was sort of like frantically jotting down notes throughout all of them here. And I will say, by way of commentary and sort of riffing on what Tilo just nicely said, whenever I hear the phrase Jain Yoga, I usually run screaming. Having been involved with Jains since the late 90s, I have to say that Jain Yoga is a rather new direction of sort of studies of Jainism. And so I really appreciated the chance to sit down and listen to the papers and think about the ways that, this term is being used and deployed, some of the themes that are coming up, some of the really great ways that we're kind of getting back into philological and philosophical scholarship in ways that I actually do find are actually informed pretty well by the last sort of 20 or 30 years of scholarship that has been largely anthropological. And I really have to say that Tilo did a fantastic job of sort of summing up a lot of the ways that I have felt and thought about like what we think about Jain Yoga and whether or not we're sort of putting too much emphasis on it these days. But yeah. So for me, some of the big themes that came up in almost all of the papers were kind of a series of dialectics or dualisms. Of course, going back to sort of the very first paper from Pragyad, right? Artificial intelligence versus perhaps real intelligence. But yeah, just now I've been sort of dealing with the idea of ChatGPT sort of taking over my students' brilliance in their assignments. And all sorts of new ways where we're trying to quiz artificial intelligence things to see if they're going to come up with answers that only a human would come up with, or if they're going to come up with sort of more ChatGPT-ish artificial intelligence responses to those things, which makes me think that Blade Runner has indeed just become necessary. So thank you for that, Philip K. Dick. Right, but more dualisms, more things come up, right? So the idea of sort of body and soul, right? We have often, I think, railed in the last 20 or 30 years in the field of religious studies about the great disservice that modern, especially Victorian era scholars did to sort of fetishize the distinction between sort of the external and the internal, the body and the mind, right? Sort of the things that really are markers of modern philosophy. And that this is one of the things that when we sort of turn to Jainism, right, we're not going to find sort of that progressive idea of, right, not sort of having these kinds of dialectics or dualisms, right, that the body and the soul rather than the body and the mind are often like the fundamental distinction. And that's right. Jain yoga is sort of a yoga in its goal, right, that the idea is to de-link the body and the soul. And then that way, right, we see some more of these kinds of distinctions coming up here. And that the idea of that came up in Eileen Goddard's paper of sort of raga to the vitaraga. I really appreciated that and sort of thinking through how bhakti is so much a part of sort of the fundamentals, if you will, of the Jaina Vashikas, the sort of the process of what you actually do as a Jain. Right, which I think in the sort of broader view of this course, we would sort of tend to categorize as Jain yoga, but is actually not a term that in the very moments that we expect to find it, right, we don't find the term yoga. And what we find are other vocabularies and sort of keeping those other vocabularies in frame, right, as we think about what kinds of things count as sort of yoga, what kinds of things count as sort of the path of Jainism. We're also coming up with another kind of kind of a tension, a dialectic, one that John Court has, of course, identified for us, which is the moksha marg and sort of the path of well-being, or sort of the nature of well-being, which is not a sort of separate path in Jainism, but rather an idea that, right, moksha, if we only focus on the sort of the quest for moksha, right, we're going to miss an awful lot about what it means to be Jain, and we're going to make a few assumptions, probably, right, sort of bringing our own kind of Victorian baggage in with us about whether or not devotion counts. So much so that the very framing of the question of, is there even a devotional form of Jainism, was sort of something that we had to entertain as I think we transitioned into, I'd say, this new era of Jain studies, beginning with Padmanabh Jaini. And that's so much of what John's work was trying to do, is to sort of, get us out of those other kind of modernist frames of thinking, perhaps do something, I don't know, postmodern, alternately modern, or whatever, but things that got us to focus on what those relationships, what those tensions actually mean to each other in a Jain context. And it was in that I really appreciated Kojin's paper that was looking at the pravritti, nivritti distinctions as styles of yoga, if you will. Thinking through those sort of like engagements or sort of active forms, and then the others that are perhaps more sort of, trying to sort of distance the self from the things that it otherwise is linked with. And so some of the questions that came up for me as I was listening to all of these papers is yoga, right, sort of becomes a convenient term for a twofold devotional and ascetic path, right? The distinctions that I often think about are bhakti and tapas, right? And, the things that I tend to think about when it comes to that relationship is, right, do we have sort of one or the other as legitimate paths to being Jain? Right. Tapas, right, seems to be the purview of ascetics. And right there, like if sort of the idealized vision of the ascetic is this figure who sort of divorces him or herself from reality, or sort of the world of obligations, such as family and marriage and property and title and claims and all of that, to go try to write a yoga oneself by means of some sort of disciplinary path, a yoga. Right. And yet, right, what we find in the midst of that is a great deal of bhakti, right? Chaityavanda and Guruvandana, right? All of that that's sort of built into how does one cultivate oneself, right? The sort of this virtue ethic kind of path of ascetic work. On the other hand, when we look at the lay communities, we find all sorts of glorifications of acts of tapas, right? Right now, we're just in the middle of the Ayambil Oli. So, right, there's all sorts of Jain lay women all over the place who have been eating, sort of fermented gruel or non-fermented gruel, and sort of aswada foods, right, all week long, and a few men too, I suppose, while they engage in pratikraman and sort of the communitarian acts of performative tapas that also do the very work that we think of in sort of the Durkheimian phase of the idea of sort of the reinforcement of communal values that are kind of built into the performance in a communal space of yoga, right, of tapas, that has built into it, right, very much a bhakti kind of notion, right? Like, how does one understand the relationship of bhakti and tapas, both as an ascetic practice and as lay practice, right? Is it merely sort of like, well, the people who have raga, right, ought to do the right kinds of raga, which is one of the things that came up for me. Is like, yeah, so we have this sort of like path, progression, a notion that you're sort of stepping your way through these things, and that sort of the ultimately, right, to get to vitaraga, you have to sort of like cultivate the right kind of raga. Okay, well enough. And that's sort of a historical question that we can sort of dig into, like, is the body of Jain literature on this question of raga something that we can sort of think of as sort of stepped, or as, right, sort of alternate paths, or is this actually something that's like not a distinction, really? I don't know. As a historian, I really do want us to kind of dig into the moments in which all of these texts are produced, right? Who are they having conversations with? What is going on sort of in their respective moments? And I appreciated the paper that looked into Hemachandra Alba's paper that was thinking about the context in which Hemachandra is speaking to Kumarpal, right, as a Shaiva king who has perhaps recently converted to Jainism, or sort of finding himself more and more under the performative sway of doing things that ought to look Jain, like at the very least. And sort of thinking about a textual world in which that literary production about the relationship between Kumarpal and Hemachandra becomes so central to the ways of thinking about sovereignty, of thinking about the proper role of monastics in sort of political spaces of the court. Especially when most of that stuff was actually written well after that relationship was sort of in the books of history, right? So most of the relationship of Kumarpal and Hemachandra was actually written during the period of time of the Sultanate, sort of annexation and sort of rule in Western India, which, you know, we can talk about at another time. So thinking about historically, like getting into figures like Yashovijay and Vivekananda, in Jeff Long's paper, Yashovijay really sort of, right, he sort of lives well within the entire period of Aurangzeb's reign in the sort of the last of the great four Mughals, in a period in which Jain community was sort of alternately both bankrolling, as if you've seen Sudev Sheth's recent book, Bankrolling Empire, highly recommend it, right? Jains are on one hand bankrolling the Mughal Empire, right? And to the tune of sort of massive investments in jewelry and all of these sort of fantastic transfers of wealth going into the Mughal court via other parts of the world, and Jains were the brokers of that. Right. And at the same time, sort of a new intellectual movement that's going on in which you have Arabic and Persian translations of Yoga-dṛṣṭi-samuccaya, and sort of other investments in sort of the yoga tradition going on from a courtly project in which Jains were absolutely participating in those things, right? And sort of Audrey Trusky's work in the Mughal period and Jains in the Mughal courts, right? Sort of give us that realm of sort of the intellectual perspective of, you know, sort of how do Sanskrit and Persianate worlds speak to one another. So I'd really like to encourage both Alba and Jeff to sort of think about Yashovijay as sort of own historical context as such, and sort of what it is that he's talking about when he talks about whether that's tolerance or something else. Yeah, and similarly, Vivekananda is also thinking about a sort of a decolonial moment of sort of trying to at least epistemically decolonize, if you will, certain ways of thinking about the traditions that he's sort of trying to sort of bring together, right? And as we think about something like the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, there's often a lot of conversation about what kind of things is he doing to bring a number of different forms of yoga together and synthesize them, try to work out sort of what is yoga. I think with Vivekananda, we're seeing another kind of moment, one that is both informed by sort of European philological ideas about how to approach text, how to think through sort of the historicity of the notion of multiple yogas, right? And one in which Vivekananda has got sort of a nationalist project in mind, right? He's trying to create a kind of Indian citizen or an Indian sensibility that is trying to do something somewhat differently. And so, right, their ideas as sort of ecumenical or cosmopolitan thinkers is informed by those moments, and sort of thinking about what each of them is doing in their moment, I think would also be valuable to help us parse sort of what cosmopolitan looks like to each of them. And to sort of get back to Tillo's paper, I think one of the great questions that I had for him was sort of the idea of a disregard for ritual being recapitulated through the idea of Jaina yoga, or that Jainism is a yoga. And I really appreciated that perspective. Of course, being sort of well-trained by anthropologists myself, I find a lot of the conversations that I've had with donors over the years is, right, the things that your grandmother taught you how to do to be Jain are actually really valuable. And the more that we fetishize text, and the more we sort of think about sort of these deeply individualistic things without recognizing them as sort of part of the neoliberal capitalist global world order, that India itself is also trying to deploy in specific ways in its own sort of new nationalist moment, right? All of these things, I think, ask us to really be careful about how we sort of use terms and phrases like Jain yoga, or think of Jainism as a yoga, perhaps to the detriment of recognizing what is still actually like the real religious life of, I would say, 99% of Jains. So yeah, I really appreciated the chance to hear and think through all these papers. And now you just get a chance to sort of, get what the screeching tires that came out of all of this reflection now. So thank you so much, Kojin, for inviting me to be part of this. And I hope this elicits a good conversation for the next session.
Oh, I'm sure it will. Yeah, these are very good, important points. Really keeping in mind the historical moment in which these texts are written before we draw broad inferences about interfaith dialogue, contemplative practices, and that. And then also the caution of not falling back into the Indologist sort of fetishization of texts, contemplative practices that reinforce Protestant assumptions and Protestant needs about the inner light or your own direct connection to God, that sort of is suspicious of religious authorities and temples and rituals. I think it's, there's a lot of conversation with Protestant Buddhism, approach to that. And I think a similar analogy can be made there. And then also how our current moment of global capitalism is now being shaped by our discourse around yoga and Jain yoga. It's very, very important. Again, I liken that to the critiques against the mindfulness movement. And at what point are we decontextualizing so much that we're actually committing intellectual colonialism ourselves by redefining a tradition that doesn't match its own self-identity? And then with the hegemony and the power and privilege of being the academy, our redefinition of a tradition will then displace and erase that tradition. And I think keeping your eye on the historical moment and a broader context of yoga is very important. And all those caveats before we use the term Jain yoga really need to be made and need to be at the foreground. I would also mention that in our contemplative studies book volume that I did with Dr. Rita Sherman and Purushottam Bill Moria, what we did is we were really trying to expand the notion of contemplative studies. There's a certain assumption, Protestant assumption with that as well, too, that values sort of individualist, Western individualism and an approach to spirituality and suspicion against religion. And so we subtitled it Ritual and Prayer as well. And so really trying to understand contemplative practices in a South Asian context is not just sitting, closing your eyes and meditating on the inner voice and connection to the divine, like it would be in a more Protestant context. It really does involve these embodied practices, bhakti practices, these ritual practices, and that we have to be careful not to decontextualize. And remember the historical moment. That's my synopsis of Steve Voss's excellent presentation there. I really, really appreciated that, especially the dialogue with Thilo as well. I think that we all benefited quite a bit from that last spot.